Hello gamers, Agafor here and welcome to the Science of Bleeding. In this series we'll be looking at how bleeding works, how fast you lose blood, protection against bleeding and the different types of bleeding in DayZ. Before that, let's start with the basics for the newer players of DayZ Standalone. When you spawn into the game you start with 5000 blood. This is the maximum amount of blood you can have. When you are attacked, you lose a chunk of blood initially and have a chance to receive the bleeding debuff. This debuff will make you lose a certain amount of blood per second. To remove the bleeding debuff, simply bandage yourself with rags or bandages. When your blood value drops below 500 or 10%, you will go unconscious. When your blood value drops to 0, you will die. Now, because the animation for going unconscious looks like this, and the animation for dying looks like this, and we know the differences between the two animations is 500 blood, we can record the time it takes from going unconscious to dying, then work out the blood lost per second. Here is that theory in the form of a formula. 500 blood lost divided by the seconds it took to go from 500 blood to 0 blood equals blood lost per second. Everyone got that? Good. Let's get to some experimenting. First up, we're going to find out the different types of bleeding in DayZ Standalone. There are 4 types of damaging attacks: blunt, stab, slash and ballistic. Blunt first, 1 minute 40 seconds or 100 seconds exactly. Here is an example of using our formula to work out the blood loss per second. 500 blood divided by the seconds it took to die, in this case 100 seconds, equals 5 blood lost per second. Okay, stab next, again 100 seconds or 5 blood per second. Slash attacks, once again 100 seconds, 5 blood per second. Now ballistic, 25 seconds or 20 blood lost per second. Interesting stuff. So there are different types of bleeding, but not how I would imagine it. I'd imagine a splitting axe would cause much more bleeding than a pipe wrench. It simply does not. From these results we can also see that weapon damage has no effect on how much blood you lose per second. Obviously because a splitting axe does way more damage than a screwdriver. So the 2 types of bleeding in DayZ Standalone are ballistic and melee, or melee for you people with mild OCD. Some of you will probably have noticed you go unconscious faster when you have multiple bleeding debuffs. But how do multiple bleeding debuffs affect a player? 4 attacks with melee damage. This should technically cause 4 times the blood lost per second. It does, 25 seconds or 20 blood per second. As suspected, the amount of bleeding is directly multiplied by the base amount that attack type applies in terms of bleeding. Moving on. When you're at stage 1 energized and not thirsty, you regenerate blood. However, does regenerating blood affect the speed at which you lose blood? Yes and no. While blood does regenerate while bleeding, it doesn't give you any bonus reductions in blood lost per second. Next, we wanted to test if you lose more blood while standing idle versus sprinting. Melee first, we know that 4 stabs causes you to go unconscious from around maximum blood in 228 seconds. Let's test that while sprinting. 228 seconds, no difference there then. Now ballistic, we know that 1 shot causes you to go unconscious in 189 seconds, while sprinting 284 seconds. That's an increase of 50%, amazeballs. Meaning when you bleed from a bullet wound you lose 50% less blood per second while sprinting, a useful bit of info. The main cause of a player bleeding in DayZ will probably be the result of meeting a very hungry zombie. So how much blood do you lose per second when bleeding from a zombie attack? In this experiment I was the test dummy. I got hit once in the chest by a zombie. I went unconscious to dead in 100 seconds, so 5 blood per second. However, this was a military zombie. What about normal zombies? Again, 100 seconds or 5 blood per second. So technically, after receiving the bleeding debuff from a zombie, you can survive for around 15 minutes before going unconscious due to blood loss, given that you were only attacked once. One of the patterns we've noticed in part 1 is that the minimum amount you can bleed per second is 5. So, in part 2, we're going to look at additional ways to reduce blood loss to this minimum level. We'll look at how much blood you lose on each part of your body through ballistic and melee damage. We'll find out if clothes reduce the blood you lose per second, and which is the best armor to wear to reduce the chances of getting the bleeding debuff. So stick around for all that juicy stuff. If you learned something in this video, show your support with a like. Thank you for watching. I will see you in part 2 of the Science of Bleeding next week on Sunday.